When I was first invited to come and speak with you, I had in my mind an audience of about 40 or 50 people. Clearly, we have scaled up this enterprise enormously. And as intimidating as it is to face a room of 500 people, as somebody who's been involved in the issue of climate change for close to 3 decades now, it is enormously encouraging to see so many of you engaged in this crucial threat to our economy and environment. Climate change is not new science. It can be traced back to the work of the French mathematician Joseph Fourier and the Swedish chemist Saint Berlinius in the 19th century. The impacts of climate change are not new either. I have a collection of reports at home done by the Canadian Climate Programme Board dating from the 1980s on the impacts of climate change. And proposed actions to tackle the threat of climate change are not new either. We have policy documents, including several national climate action plans, that collect dust on many bookshelves. What is new is that governments, industry, and civil society are now taking notice and beginning to act. The key element of all this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I've been involved in for the last 20 odd years or so. It was established almost 30 years ago now, in 1988, to provide governments with accessible and balanced assessments of the state of our knowledge on climate change. The first report was completed in 1990. At that time, there was adequate observational evidence that climate change had been detected. That is to say, that the signal had come out of the noise of natural climate variability. However, at that time, its attribution to human cause could not be made. That came with the IPCC's second assessment report in 1995, with the statement, and I quote, "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible influence on the global climate." In the IPCC's latest report, which was released in 2014, it was concluded that, and I quote, "It is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century." That key term, extremely likely, is a very well calibrated term of the IPCC, and basically science never gets any more strong than that. One of the findings, the main findings of this fifth report, was that there's an almost linear relationship between the cumulative global emissions of greenhouse gases, that is to say, the sum total of all emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the resultant temperature increase. And this puts a constraint on future emissions. Once we have decided on a temperature target, for example, to avoid what the intergovernmental process refers to as dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, that gives us a budget, a limit on emissions, and hence on the quantity of fossil fuels we can burn in the future. As has been mentioned previously, we may very well have to leave some of our known fossil fuels and reserves in the ground. But the climate maths, as Tom Rand said earlier, and David Hone, is really unassailable. Work has already begun on preparing the sixth IPCC report, and that will be completed and finalized in 2021, sorry. There's a growing sense that having defined the threat of climate change, the IPCC now needs to focus on solutions. Now, this needs to respect the IPCC's mandate to be policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. Thus, what is needed is a manual of what works and what doesn't work in adapting to the inevitable impacts of climate change and in reducing our future emissions of greenhouse gases. And what drives this need is the claim based on several lines of scientific evidence, that we are running out of time. One of the arguments that is driving this urgency is that the climate system has a memory due to the long-term storage of heat in the oceans and the long lifetime of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Emissions of carbon dioxide today, for example, can still be in the atmosphere 1,000 years from now. The unfortunate consequence of this is that whatever we do over the next few decades to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, global average temperatures will increase by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. It is as though that part of history has already been written. Now, since about 1998, and for much of the following 2 decades, the increase of global average temperatures seems to have slowed down. And this led the climate change naysayers to claim that global warming is over, that we don't have to worry anymore, that we don't have to change the use of fossil fuels, and most perniciously, that it was all a hoax perpetuated by the world community of scientists. This debate over this apparent pause in the global warming trend occurred during the IPCC's 5th assessment report and was reflected in some of the earlier drafts. You have to understand that preparing these IPCC reports takes somewhere between 5 and 10 years, not just to write the reports, but also to go through an extremely exhaustive review process. The final statement, though, of Working Group 1 of the 5th assessment report noted, and I quote, "Due to natural variability, trends based on short-term records are very sensitive to the beginning and end dates and do not in general reflect long-term trends." So it was a cautionary note, and not much more. Since then, one explanation that was proposed after the IPCC's 5th assessment report had been completed was that as much as 90% of the heat trapped in the atmosphere by the increase in the concentrations of greenhouse gases was being transferred to the oceans, where instead of warming the atmosphere, was rather warming the seas, the oceans, which have a much larger thermal capacity. Thus, there had not been a hiatus or pause in global warming, but a shift in the climate system that led to a greater warming of the oceans rather than the atmosphere. To some extent, in some ways, this so-called hiatus has been a bit of a sideshow. As stated in the IPCC's 5th assessment report, and I quote, "Each of the last 2 decades has been successfully warmer at the Earth's surface than any preceding decade since 1850. And as the Minister mentioned, we have also recently concluded that 2015 was the warmest year since globally comprehensive records began in 1880. And 2016 is likely to be even warmer. The 6-month period between January and June of this year was the planet's warmest half-year on record, with an average temperature of 1.5, almost 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than the late 19th century. That's a very significant number. And according to recent data from NASA, July was the warmest month since pre-industrial times, and August temperatures are just as large a deviation from normal. In addition, global sea levels are now the highest on record, and because of that heat already stored in the oceans, will increase further, threatening many coastal communities. In addition, the extent of Arctic sea ice appears to have reached a record low wintertime maximum for the 2nd year in a row. But perhaps more dramatically, it was estimated that on Christmas Day 2015, the waters at the North Pole were above freezing. So much for the Santa Claus myth. The significance of all this is that at the UN Climate Conference in Paris in November of last year, governments agreed to work to hold the increase in global average temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to more than 1.5. So I said 1.5 is a very significant number. Fortunately, current emission commitments by governments see us on a path to some 3 degrees Celsius. We are clearly on an overshoot scenario. The planet is warming at a pace that has not been experienced within the past millennia. And these worrying statistics emphasize the urgency to address the threat of climate change in order to avoid the worst impacts on our environment and our economy.